War is often remembered through images of trenches flooded with mud, soldiers charging into machine gun fire, and artillery tearing landscapes apart. But during the First World War, there was another battlefield, one far less visible, yet just as deadly. This was the battlefield of the mind. In this video, we will explore how psychological warfare was used systematically for the first time on a global scale, how fear became a weapon, how rumors killed as effectively as bullets, and how entire armies were manipulated, broken, or driven forward, not only by force, but by carefully engineered terror. What you are about to see is not a story of explosions and steel alone, but of whispers, symbols, lies, propaganda, and the fragile psychology of men pushed beyond human limits. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. When the First World War erupted in 1914, no nation truly understood what modern industrialized warfare would do to the human mind. Military planners focused on numbers, firepower, and territory. Yet within months, the war revealed itself as something entirely new, static, relentless, and psychologically suffocating. Soldiers did not fight for days or weeks, they endured for years. And in that endurance, psychological warfare emerged not as a side effect, but as a deliberate strategy. One of the earliest psychological shocks came from the sudden realization that the war would not be short. In the summer of 1914, young men marched to the front believing they would be home by Christmas. This belief was actively reinforced by governments and newspapers, not by accident, but as a morale strategy. Optimism itself became a psychological weapon. When that promise collapsed, it shattered not only hope, but trust. Letters from soldiers in late 1914 already reveal a deep sense of betrayal. The first psychological wound of the war was not caused by an enemy, it was caused by expectation. As trenches solidified across the Western Front, psychological pressure became constant and unavoidable. Soldiers lived under the permanent threat of death, surrounded by rotting corpses, rats, lice, and the sound of artillery that never truly stopped. The enemy was often invisible, hidden behind miles of earthworks. This uncertainty was psychologically devastating. Not knowing when the next shell would land was worse than knowing for sure. Military doctors later recorded that soldiers frequently described the waiting as more unbearable than the combat itself. Artillery played a central role in psychological warfare. Beyond its physical destruction, it was designed to break the enemy's nerves. Prolonged bombardments were often launched not to destroy defenses, but to mentally exhaust defenders before an assault. Shells would fall day and night, sometimes for weeks. Soldiers learned that sleep was dangerous, silence was terrifying. Any pause in shelling could mean an attack was coming. Fear became rhythmic, synchronized with the distant thud of guns. This constant exposure led to a condition that came to be known as shell shock. At first, military authorities believed it was caused by physical damage to the brain from explosions, but as cases increased, it became clear that many soldiers showed symptoms without being near a blast. They trembled uncontrollably, lost the ability to speak, became paralyzed, or collapsed emotionally. Shell shock was not weakness, it was the mind's response to sustained psychological trauma. And yet, many armies treated it as cowardice, adding shame as another psychological weapon, this time turned inward. Governments quickly realized that fear could be shaped, directed, and amplified. Propaganda became one of the most powerful tools of psychological warfare. Posters, newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches portrayed the enemy not simply as a military opponent, but as a monstrous threat to civilization itself. Germans were depicted as barbaric Huns, while Allied soldiers were portrayed as invaders threatening women, children, and religion. These images were not subtle. They were meant to provoke rage, hatred, and moral justification for total war. One of the most effective propaganda tactics was atrocity stories. Reports of enemy soldiers committing horrific acts, often exaggerated or entirely fabricated, spread rapidly. Stories of mutilated civilians, bayoneted babies, and destroyed churches filled newspapers. Even when false, these stories achieved their purpose. They hardened public opinion and fueled fear. Soldiers entering combat already believed the enemy was capable of unimaginable cruelty, making surrender psychologically unthinkable. Leaflets became another key weapon. Aircraft and artillery were used to drop thousands of pamphlets behind enemy lines. These leaflets often targeted soldiers directly, questioning the purpose of the war, exaggerating casualty numbers, or suggesting that their families had been abandoned at home. Some included forged letters or fake newspaper articles designed to look authentic. The goal was not immediate desertion, but doubt. Doubt, once planted, could spread silently through the ranks. Sound itself became a psychological weapon. At night, soldiers reported hearing voices carried across no man's land, sometimes real, sometimes imagined. Troops shouted insults, played music, or broadcast messages through megaphones. The Germans were particularly known for using recorded sounds, including fake troop movements or construction noises, to confuse and intimidate the enemy. Silence, again, was used strategically. Sudden quiet could be more terrifying than noise, signaling an imminent attack.
Snipers contributed heavily to psychological warfare. Even when they killed few men, their presence paralyzed entire units. Soldiers became afraid to lift their heads, to look over the trench, to move in daylight. The knowledge that death could come instantly and invisibly created constant tension. Diaries from the front repeatedly mentioned the terror of the unseen enemy, a fear that drained morale far more effectively than open battle. Gas warfare, introduced in 1915, was perhaps the most psychologically devastating innovation of the war. The mere threat of gas was often enough to induce panic. Soldiers described the first gas attacks as surreal and horrifying. Clouds rolling silently across the battlefield, men choking, blinded, screaming. Even after gas masks were introduced, fear remained. Masks restricted breathing, vision, and communication. Soldiers learned to sleep with them on, knowing that a few seconds of delay could mean death. Gas did not just attack the body, it invaded the mind. The uncertainty of survival reshaped how soldiers thought about life and death. Many accounts describe a gradual emotional numbness. Others describe extreme fatalism. Psychological warfare did not always aim to create panic. Sometimes its effect was to erase emotion entirely. A soldier who no longer cared whether he lived or died was still useful in an assault, but at immense human cost. Commanders also used psychological pressure within their own armies. Strict discipline, public punishments, and executions for desertion were intended to maintain order, but they also created an atmosphere of fear. Soldiers were trapped psychologically between two threats, the enemy in front of them and their own officers behind them. This internal pressure cooker intensified mental collapse. As the war dragged on, psychological warfare became increasingly sophisticated. Intelligence services studied enemy morale, intercepted letters, and analyzed rumors. They learned that morale was as decisive as ammunition. Entire offensives were planned around breaking the enemy's will rather than destroying their forces outright. By the end of the First World War, millions of men returned home, physically alive, but psychologically shattered. The war had revealed something terrifying, that the human mind could be weaponized on an industrial scale. Psychological warfare was no longer an accidental consequence of combat. It was now a permanent part of modern war. By the second year of the First World War, military leaders had come to a grim realization. Victory would not be decided solely by who possessed more soldiers or heavier guns, but by who could endure longer without psychological collapse. The battlefield had evolved into a laboratory of fear, and psychological warfare was refined through observation, repetition, and ruthless experimentation. Armies learned not only how to kill the enemy, but how to exhaust his will to continue fighting. One of the most powerful psychological tools was uncertainty. Soldiers rarely knew where they were going, how long an attack would last, or what awaited them beyond the next trench line. Orders were often vague by necessity, but this vagueness magnified anxiety. Men advanced into battle without understanding the objective, aware only that many would not return. Letters and diaries reveal that this lack of information created a deep sense of helplessness. When a soldier does not understand why he is suffering, the suffering becomes harder to endure. Nighttime was particularly effective for psychological pressure. Darkness transformed familiar landscapes into unknown threats. Soldiers described how every sound, footsteps, whispers, the rustling of rats, felt amplified. Commanders exploited this fear. Raids were deliberately launched at night, not always to capture territory, but to keep the enemy awake and mentally strained. A single nighttime attack could leave soldiers tense for weeks afterward, anticipating its return. Raiding parties themselves became instruments of terror. Small, highly trained units crossed no man's land under cover of darkness, killing silently, capturing prisoners, or simply leaving behind signs that they had been there. The knowledge that the enemy could appear at any moment shattered any sense of safety. Some raids were designed to leave survivors intentionally, ensuring that fear spread through first-hand testimony. Rumors were another devastating psychological weapon. In the confined world of the trenches, information traveled rapidly, often distorted along the way. Stories of entire units wiped out, new weapons being deployed, or imminent massive offensives circulated constantly. Enemy intelligence services actively encouraged this. Captured soldiers were sometimes released deliberately after being fed exaggerated stories of overwhelming enemy strength. Once released, these men became unwitting carriers of psychological contagion. Food shortages and poor living conditions further eroded morale. While not always intentionally created for psychological effect, they were often exploited. Soldiers fighting on empty stomachs were more susceptible to despair. Letters from the front frequently mention hunger as more demoralizing than fear of death. The mind weakens when the body is deprived, and commanders understood this connection intuitively, if not scientifically. Propaganda aimed at civilians played a crucial role in psychological warfare at the front. Soldiers depended emotionally on letters from home. When propaganda at home emphasized sacrifice, duty, and endurance, it could strengthen resolve. But when reality diverged too sharply from propaganda promises, the effect was corrosive. Soldiers began to feel misunderstood, reused. Some wrote bitterly about civilians who spoke of glory while living far from the front lines. This emotional divide deepened psychological isolation. Censorship intensified this strain. Soldiers knew their letters were read, words removed, truths softened. Many resorted to coded language to express fear or despair. The inability to speak openly, even to loved ones, added another layer of psychological pressure. Silence became both a shield and a prison. The deliberate use of fear reached its peak during major offensives. Prolonged preliminary bombardments, sometimes lasting days, were designed as much to terrify as to destroy. Soldiers trapped in trenches during these bombardments described feeling hunted, powerless, reduced to instinct. Some prayed constantly, others dissociated entirely. Military psychologists later noted that the anticipation of death was often more traumatic than death itself. False attacks were also used as psychological tools. Artillery would suddenly intensify, suggesting an imminent assault, only to stop abruptly. Soldiers rushed to defensive positions repeatedly, exhausting themselves emotionally and physically. Over time, this constant state of alert degraded their ability to respond effectively when a real attack came. The mind, overwhelmed, began to fail. Deception extended beyond the battlefield. Fake troop movements, dummy tanks, false radio transmissions, and staged logistical operations were designed to confuse enemy intelligence and create paranoia. When soldiers believed they were surrounded or outnumbered, resistance weakened. Even experienced units could be broken if they believed defeat was inevitable. Prisoners of war became psychological weapons as well. Captured soldiers were sometimes treated well deliberately, then allowed to send letters home describing their conditions. The goal was to suggest that surrender was preferable to continued fighting. Other times, prisoners were mistreated intentionally, knowing that rumors of brutality would spread and provoke either terror or blind hatred, both useful emotions for sustaining total war. Religious belief, once a source of comfort, was also manipulated psychologically. Chaplains struggled to explain mass death within traditional moral frameworks. Some soldiers found solace in faith, while others lost it entirely. The sense that God had abandoned the battlefield appears frequently in personal accounts. This spiritual crisis compounded psychological trauma, leaving many feeling utterly alone. The concept of heroism itself was weaponized. Medals, honors, and public recognition were used to encourage acts of extreme bravery. While these rewards inspired some, they also created guilt and pressure. Soldiers who survived while others died questioned their worth. Those who failed to meet heroic ideals felt shame. Psychological warfare does not only break the enemy, it reshapes the self-image of those who fight. Medical understanding lagged behind reality. Military doctors struggled to cope with the scale of psychological injury. Treatments ranged from rest and counseling to electric shock therapy and punishment. Many soldiers were accused of malingering. The fear of being labeled a coward forced countless men to remain at the front despite mental collapse. The system itself became a source of terror. As the war progressed, soldiers developed their own psychological defenses. Dark humor flourished. Jokes about death, sarcasm toward authority, and fatalistic acceptance became coping mechanisms. Trench songs often carried morbid lyrics, mocking danger and loss. This gallows humor was not indifference, it was survival. Despite these defenses, morale continued to erode. Mutinies, desertions, and breakdowns increased, particularly after catastrophic offensives with little visible gain. The French Army mutinies of 1917 stand as a powerful example. Soldiers refused to attack, not out of cowardice, but because psychologically they had reached their limit. They would defend, but no longer advance into what they believed was certain death. Commanders responded with a mix of repression and reform. Some units were punished harshly to restore discipline through fear. Others received better leave policies, improved food, and rotations away from the front. These changes reveal an important truth. Psychological warfare worked in both directions. Maintaining morale required as much attention as destroying the enemy's mind. By the later stages of the war, psychological factors were openly acknowledged in strategic planning. Intelligence reports included assessments of enemy morale. Leaflet campaigns became more targeted. The mind had become a recognized front of war. Yet, for the men in the trenches, these strategies were not abstract theories. They were lived realities, etched into memory through sleepless nights, trembling hands, and silent screams. Psychological warfare was not an invisible concept. It was a daily presence, shaping every decision, every fear, every fragile hope. As the First World War entered its later years, psychological warfare no longer operated in isolation. It became deeply intertwined with national identity, cultural values, leadership styles, and the social fabric of each country involved. While fear, exhaustion, and trauma were universal, different armies responded distinct ways. The war revealed that psychological endurance was shaped not only by individual resilience, but by how societies understood authority, sacrifice, and meaning. The German army entered the war with a strong belief in discipline, order, and obedience. This cultural framework initially provided psychological stability.
Soldiers were trained to endure hardship without question, and early victories reinforced confidence. However, this same rigidity became a vulnerability as the war dragged on. The inability to openly acknowledge psychological suffering led to suppressed trauma. German soldiers wrote less about fear and more about duty, but beneath this restraint, morale slowly eroded. By 1918, food shortages at home and the realization that victory was slipping away created a powerful sense of futility. Psychological collapse did not arrive suddenly, it seeped in quietly. British forces, in contrast, relied heavily on tradition and regimental identity. Units built strong internal bonds, often recruiting men from the same towns or professions. This fostered camaraderie and mutual responsibility, which acted as a psychological buffer. Soldiers fought not only for their country, but for the men beside them. Yet this system also intensified grief. When a regiment suffered heavy losses, entire communities at home were devastated. The psychological burden extended beyond the battlefield, creating a shared national trauma. French soldiers endured perhaps most relentless psychological strain. Much of the war was fought on French soil, transforming familiar villages into killing fields. The emotional weight of defending one's homeland cut both ways. It fueled determination, but it also magnified despair. By 1917, after repeated offensives with catastrophic casualties, French morale reached a breaking point. The mutinies that followed were not acts of rebellion against France, but against hopelessness. Soldiers demanded rest, better conditions, and an end to what they saw as meaningless sacrifice. Their refusal to attack was a psychological statement. Endurance had limits. The Russian army faced unique psychological challenges. Poor equipment, weak leadership, and vast distances undermined morale from the start. Soldiers often lacked basic supplies, and communication failures left them feeling abandoned. Rumors spread unchecked, amplifying fear and resentment. Psychological warfare here was less about enemy action and more about internal collapse. By 1917, the Army's psychological disintegration mirrored the unraveling of the Russian state itself. Soldiers no longer believed in the war, their leaders, or the future. When belief dies, armies dissolve. Colonial troops experienced psychological warfare in an even more complex way. Soldiers from Africa, India, and other colonies fought in climates and landscapes utterly alien to them. They faced not only enemy fire, but racial prejudice and cultural isolation. Many were deliberately deployed in high-risk roles, reinforcing a sense of disposability. Yet their presence also became a psychological weapon. European propaganda often portrayed colonial soldiers as terrifying and exotic, designed to frighten enemy troops. This dehumanization cut both ways, inflicting lasting psychological scars on those forced into such roles.
Across all armies, the prolonged nature of the war shattered traditional ideas of courage and masculinity. Soldiers who broke down mentally felt deep shame, reinforced by military culture. Fear was seen as weakness, despite being universal. This stigma silenced suffering. Many men learned to hide symptoms of psychological collapse, pushing themselves until they could no longer function. The battlefield became a place where emotional expression was dangerous. The medical response to psychological trauma reflected this misunderstanding. Treatments varied wildly. Some doctors attempted compassionate care, recognizing shell shock as a legitimate injury. Others used harsh methods to force soldiers back to the front. Electric shock therapy, isolation, and humiliation were common. These practices were rooted in the belief that fear could be punished out of a man. Instead, they often deepened trauma, turning hospitals into extensions of the battlefield. Leadership played a crucial psychological role. Commanders who rotated troops, improved living conditions, and acknowledged mental strain tended to maintain higher morale. Those who relied solely on punishment and rhetoric often saw breakdowns escalate. This contrast demonstrated a critical lesson. Psychological warfare is not only about attacking the enemy's mind, but about protecting one's own. Technology continued to influence psychological stress. The introduction of tanks initially terrified enemy troops, who described them as unstoppable monsters. Yet once their limitations became known, their psychological impact diminished. This pattern repeated throughout the war. New weapons shocked the mind first, then lost their terror through familiarity. Fear evolved, adapting to each innovation. Air warfare added a new psychological dimension. Bombing raids on cities blurred the line between front and home. Civilians became targets, and soldiers worried constantly about their families. This anxiety distracted and weakened morale. The knowledge that no place was truly safe transformed war into a total psychological experience. Despite the immense pressure, soldiers sought meaning wherever they could find it. Some clung to nationalism, others to faith, friendship, or routine. Writing letters, keeping diaries, and maintaining rituals helped preserve a sense of identity. These small acts of normalcy were acts of resistance against psychological annihilation. By 1918, psychological exhaustion was widespread. Even victorious armies were mentally drained. The final offensive succeeded not only because of military superiority, but because enemy morale was already fractured. The war ended not with triumph, but with relief. Relief that the mental suffering might finally stop. Yet the end of fighting did not mean the end of psychological warfare's effects. Millions returned home carrying invisible wounds. Nightmares, anxiety, emotional numbness, and sudden rage followed them into civilian life. Families struggled to understand men who had survived physically, but were changed forever. The First World War forced humanity to confront an uncomfortable truth. The mind is both a battlefield and a casualty. Psychological warfare had proven devastatingly effective, but its consequences extended far beyond strategic victory. It reshaped societies, challenged medical science, and altered how future wars would be fought. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world believed the nightmare had ended. Parades were held, flags were raised, and treaties were signed. Yet for millions of veterans, the war did not stop. Psychological warfare, which had operated relentlessly during the conflict, continued long after the armistice. The battlefield had moved from the trenches into the minds of those who survived. The First World War did not merely change borders, it permanently altered humanity's understanding of trauma, fear, and psychological endurance. Returning soldiers struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Many were haunted by memories they could not escape. Sudden noises triggered panic. Crowds felt threatening. Sleep brought vivid nightmares, while wakefulness offered little relief. At the time, there was no clear language to describe these experiences. Terms like shell shock faded, replaced by vague accusations of weakness or moral failure. Psychological suffering was largely misunderstood, leaving veterans isolated in their pain. Societies that celebrated victory often had little patience for invisible wounds. Governments prioritized physical reconstruction over mental healing. Veterans who could not work or adapt were frequently marginalized. Some turned to alcohol or withdrew entirely. Others carried their trauma silently, shaping family dynamics for generations. The psychological cost of the war became a hidden inheritance, passed down through behavior, silence, and unresolved grief. Despite this neglect, the First World War forced medical and military institutions to confront psychological injury. Early studies of combat trauma laid the foundation for modern psychiatry.
doctors began to recognize that prolonged fear, helplessness, and exposure to violence could fundamentally alter the brain and behavior. This understanding, though incomplete, marked a turning point. Psychological warfare had revealed that mental collapse was not a personal failing, but a predictable response to extreme conditions. Militaries around the world took note. The lessons of World War I shaped future conflicts profoundly. In the Second World War, psychological operations became more sophisticated and deliberate. Propaganda was refined, morale monitoring became standard, and efforts were made, at least officially, to manage combat stress more effectively. The mind was now recognized as both a weapon and a vulnerability. The war also transformed civilian psychology. Governments learned how mass communication could shape perception on a national scale. Fear, hope, and hatred could be manufactured and directed. The techniques developed during the First World War would later be used not only in war, but in politics, advertising, and social control. Psychological warfare had escaped the battlefield and entered everyday life.
Memory itself became a contested space. Monuments honored the fallen, but rarely acknowledged psychological suffering. Veterans who broke down were often absent from official narratives. This selective memory shaped how the war was remembered, as a story of sacrifice and heroism, rather than one of widespread mental devastation. Silence became another psychological weapon, this time turned against history. Yet personal accounts endured. Diaries, letters, and memoirs preserved the emotional truth of the war. These voices revealed a shared experience of fear and endurance that transcended nationality. They reminded future generations that beneath strategy and ideology were human beings pushed to their limits. Psychological warfare did not discriminate. It consumed all who were exposed to it. The concept of trauma continued to evolve throughout the 20th century. By the late decades, conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder were formally recognized, validating experiences long dismissed. This recognition traced its roots directly back to the trenches of World War I. The war had forced the world to acknowledge that the mind could be wounded as deeply as the body. Today, psychological warfare remains central to modern conflict. Disinformation, cyber operations, and media manipulation echo the leaflet drops and rumor campaigns of the Great War. The tools have changed, but the objective remains the same: to influence perception, erode trust, and break will without firing a shot. The First World War was the proving ground for this invisible form of combat. Understanding this legacy is essential. It reminds us that war is not only fought with weapons, but with ideas, emotions, and beliefs. The greatest damage is often unseen, carried quietly by those who endure it. The stories of World War I's psychological warfare challenge us to look beyond the surface of history and confront the human cost beneath. As we reflect on these 20 documented aspects of psychological warfare during the First World War, one question remains: how much of modern society's relationship with fear, propaganda, and trauma was forged in those muddy trenches over a century ago? If you watched this documentary until the end, leave a comment below with the keyword trenches to let us know you stayed until the final moment. Share your thoughts. What part of psychological warfare during the First World War impacted you the most? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and keep watching the next war documentaries appearing on your screen now. Your support helps keep these real stories alive and ensures that the invisible battles of history are never forgotten.